Mongol storm has broken a city. The walls are breached. The banners of the Jin dynasty are in the dust, and the air is thick with the metallic tang of blood and the ash of burning homes. For the vast, terrified populace herded into the open fields, the law of Genghis Khan is absolute. For cities that resisted, the great Yasa demanded one price: death. And yet, amidst the systematic extermination, a second command is given. Mongol commanders, the Nayan, walk the lines of the condemned, their eyes searching not for warriors, but for hands. The calloused hands of the blacksmith, the stained hands of the tanner, the precise hands of the silversmith. This is not mercy. It is a triage. It is the beginning of a vast imperial program of human resource acquisition. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together of the Mongol Empire. To understand the fate of the artisans of northern China, we must first discard any notion of battlefield mercy. The Mongol conquests of the early 13th century were a demographic catastrophe, executed with a logic that was both brutal and chillingly pragmatic. The Mongol war machine, composed of tumens, divisions of 10,000 horsemen, was a self-consuming entity. It had no capacity to build, only to conquer. Genghis Khan, a visionary of unparalleled ruthlessness, recognized this structural weakness. An empire of tents and horses could not rule an empire of cities and farms. This recognition was codified. While the Yasa, the Mongol legal code, was unforgiving, it was also an instrument of state building. When we analyze the accounts of the campaigns against the Jin, a clear pattern emerges. Chroniclers, both Mongol and Persian, note the exceptions to the general slaughter. In the secret history of the Mongols, and later in the works of Juvayni, we see the implementation of a strategic sieve. The process was terrifyingly simple. As a siege neared its inevitable, bloody conclusion, heralds would sometimes offer a final, specific demand. Send out your craftsmen. For the city's leadership, it was an impossible choice: to condemn their most productive citizens to an unknown fate in exchange for a few more hours of survival, or to refuse and doom them all. More often, the sorting happened after the fall. Imagine the scene. The surviving population is divided. The strong, the young, the common. They are either put to the sword, driven ahead of the army as human shields for the next siege, or, if lucky, simply scattered. But the artisans are different. They are pulled aside, their families often with them, creating a small, terrified island of potential in a sea of death. What defined their new legal status? In this moment, they ceased to be Jin subjects. They ceased, in fact, to be people with agency at all. They became nökör, a complex term that in this context meant they were the personal, almost sacred, property of the Khan himself. They were not slaves to be sold in a market, at least not yet. They were a strategic reserve, a living treasury of human skill. This policy was not uniform. It was adaptive. We find evidence of the Mongols meticulously categorizing their human loot. Blacksmiths and metallurgists were prized above all. They could forge the weapons, arrowheads, and lamellar armor the armies needed. Siege engineers were, of course, beyond price. The capture of Chinese siege specialists in 1214 during the campaign against the Jin capital of Chengdu revolutionized Mongol warfare, allowing them to crack fortified cities across Eurasia. But the sieve was finer still. Weavers, potters, painters, architects, and even musicians were gathered. The new empire would need to be built, clothed, and decorated.
Release!
This systematic harvest of skill reveals the core of Mongol imperial strategy. It was not simply plunder. It was the deliberate, large-scale, forced transfer of technology and human capital. The terror of the siege was the mechanism of extraction. The sparing of the artisan was not an act of compassion, but the first step in a state-level project of forced deportation and indentured servitude. These individuals, marked by their own talent, were now owned by the Orda, the court of the Great Khan. They had survived the fall of their world, only to be repurposed. Their identity was erased, replaced by their function. They were no longer Wang the blacksmith or Li the weaver. They were now the Khan's smith, the Khan's weaver. Their lives were spared for one reason: to serve. And their service would be demanded far from the ruins of their homes.
Halt!
A new, raw, and windswept capital being planned on the steppe, Karakorum. The journey from the ruins of Jin China to the heart of the Mongol steppe was not a migration. It was a forced deportation, a grim caravan of human assets. We must picture this trek not as a single event, but as a continuous, brutal process spanning years. These columns of captive artisans, men, women, and children, moved under the watchful eyes of Mongol escorts, blended into the vast, slow-moving tide of conquered wealth. They traveled with herds of stolen livestock and wagons piled high with silks, gold, and bronze. The blacksmiths and weavers were, in the cold calculus of the empire, simply another category of plunder, itemized and guarded with the same jealous care as a prize stallion or a chest of silver. Their destination was a testament to the Khan's will, Karakorum. When these Chinese craftsmen first arrived, likely in the 1220s, and expanding massively under Ögedei Khan in the 1230s, this was no city. It was a windswept command post on the Orkhon River, a place of yurts, rough storehouses, and vast open plains. It was a symbolic center, but it lacked the substance of an imperial capital. This is precisely what the artisans were brought to build. They were the engine, and Karakorum was the project. Here, we must deconstruct the precise legal and social status of these individuals. To call them slaves is both accurate and insufficient. When we analyze the Mongol system, we find it avoids the simple binary of free and slave that defined Roman or later Atlantic systems. These artisans were state property. They were not, by and large, sold in the great slave markets of Central Asia. Those markets were flooded with different captives, the less skilled, bound for domestic service or hard labor in Persia. Instead, the Chinese craftsmen were organized into karkhanas. These were state-run workshops, each dedicated to a specific trade. There was a karkhana for armorers, another for weavers, another for the architects and masons who would raise the city's new walls. This system, likely adapted from Central Asian and Persian models, was perfected by the Mongols. It was a mechanism of hereditary servitude. The artisans were fed and housed by the state, their rations drawn from the imperial granaries filled by tribute. They were protected property and a Mongol Nyan who harmed a skilled artisan belonging to the Khan's personal orda would face severe punishment. But this protection was the same kind afforded to a valuable tool. They had no freedom of movement. They could not leave their designated quarter. They could not choose their work. And crucially, their status was passed to their children. A blacksmith's son was a blacksmith in service to the Khan. A weaver's daughter was a weaver. The Yasa was clear on the inheritance of obligation. We see here a system that blends the corvée labor of ancient empires with the industrial organization of a state-owned enterprise. Their function was twofold. First, they supplied the Mongol war machine, the blacksmiths' forges in Karakorum, fueled by scrub from the steppe and iron brought from afar, produced an endless supply of arrowheads, lamellar plates for armor, swords, and fittings for saddles. This was their primary, non-negotiable duty. The empire ran on conquest, and conquest ran on iron. Second, they were tasked with building the idea of an empire. Genghis Khan's successors, particularly Ogedei, wanted more than a tented capital. They wanted a city, a symbol of their new permanent power that could awe foreign ambassadors and manage a global empire. The Chinese artisans, with their centuries of sophisticated urban tradition, were the only ones who could provide it. They were set to work, raising administrative buildings, palaces, and, in a sign of Mongol religious pragmatism, temples for the Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and Taoists who congregated in the city. We must pause to consider the human experience within this machinery of servitude. These were people torn from one of the world's most advanced civilizations. They left behind cities of 1 million souls, sophisticated markets, and ancestral homes, and were thrust into a harsh, alien landscape. They lived in segregated quarters, a small Chinese island in a sea of Mongol, Turkic, and Persian speakers. Their diet, their clothing, their very language set them apart. The psychological toll, unrecorded by the chroniclers, must have been immense. A permanent state of exile, their lives defined entirely by their utility to the power that had shattered their world. When we compare this system, its efficiency is terrifying. It lacked the mass market, commoditized cruelty of the Roman life of India, but it was, in its own way, more absolute. It was a targeted, state-directed appropriation of an entire class of people, defined by their skill. The Mongols did not just conquer northern China, they disassembled it. They identified its most valuable components: the engineers, the metallurgists, the administrators, and surgically extracted them, shipping them thousands of miles to be reassembled in service of a new master. This was the economic foundation of Karakorum. The city was an artificial construct, a command city that did not grow organically, but was willed into existence. It produced little of its own food. Its existence was a defiance of economic and geographic logic, as one historian notes. That defiance was paid for by the grain tribute of a continent and built by the hands of these captive artisans. They were the ghosts in the machine, the silent, skilled population whose forced labor made the imperial capital possible. Their existence was a living testament to the empire's core logic. Everything and everyone could be repurposed for the Khan's service. The existence of this captive artisan class is not speculation. It is confirmed by the most valuable primary sources we have, the accounts of the few Europeans who made the perilous journey to the Mongol heartland. When we consult the records of the Franciscan friar William of Rubruck, who arrived in Karakorum in 1254, the city comes to life. And it is a city built by foreigners. Rubruck, a man of keen observation, meticulously describes the imperial capital. He finds a cosmopolitan, walled city, but a small one, smaller than the Parisian suburb of Saint-Denis. He describes the palace of Munka Khan, the great Jer for audiences, and, most importantly, the city's distinct quarters. He notes the Saracen quarter, where merchants bustled, and a cafe, or Chinese quarter, which he noted was the largest. He describes the temples they were allowed to build. 12 idol temples, Buddhist and Taoist, 2 mosques, and an Nestorian Christian church. This was the city the Jin artisans had built. They were not just laborers. They were the architects or engineers of the Khan's religious tolerance, a tolerance that was, itself, a pragmatic tool of imperial control. But Rubruck's most famous, and for our purposes, most revealing encounter is with a man named Guillaume Boucher. He was a Parisian goldsmith, captured at Belgrade. In the very heart of the Mongol Empire, thousands of miles from his home, Boucher was now a nökör in service to the Khan. He had crafted a magnificent, automated silver tree for the Khan's palace, a marvel of engineering that dispensed 4 different kinds of liquor. Boucher's story is a crucial piece of comparative evidence. It demonstrates that the policy of artisan harvesting was not limited to China. It was a global imperial strategy. The craftsmen of China were joined by Hungarians, Persians, Alans, and Frenchmen. They were all cogs in the same karkhana system. What, then, was the ultimate fate of the Chinese blacksmiths and their families? The records show a grim persistence. The karkhana system was hereditary. The son of a smith was registered as a smith. The daughter of a weaver was registered as a weaver. We have tax and census documents from the later Yuan dynasty that are, in essence, ledgers of human skill, passed down from generation to generation. While some individuals could, through extraordinary service or favor, gain a semblance of freedom or status, the vast majority were locked into this state-owned servitude. They were a permanent, inherited class of industrial producers for the empire. Their legacy is therefore a complicated one. The city they built, Karakorum, was ultimately ephemeral. When Kublai Khan, Mongol's successor, shifted the imperial center of gravity back to China, founding the Yuan dynasty and building his new capital at Dadu, modern-day Beijing, Karakorum was left behind. The winds of the steppe began to reclaim the palaces and workshops. The forced migration of skill was, in a bitter irony, reversed. Many of the descendants of the original artisans were likely moved back to China, now to serve a Mongol emperor ruling from the dragon throne. So, what remains? It is not the stones of Karakorum. The true, invisible legacy of the blacksmiths is the very exchange that defines the era. When we speak of the Pax Mongolica and the transfer of technology, we must dismantle the myth of simple, peaceful trade along the Silk Road. For every merchant who traveled freely, we must account for 1,000 artisans who traveled in chains. The Mongol Empire functioned as a savage and gigantic transmission belt. It was these captive Chinese blacksmiths, metallurgists, and engineers who brought advanced techniques in blast furnace technology, steel production, and siegecraft westward. It was captive weavers who introduced complex nosage, cloth of gold, techniques to Persia. This was not cultural exchange. It was a state-sponsored, forced diffusion of intellectual property, carried out by enslaving the intellectuals themselves. The blacksmiths of Karakorum, plucked from the ashes of their cities, represent the true, brutal cost of the Mongol peace. Their skill was their salvation, but it was also their curse. They were spared the sword only to be shackled to the forge, their talent repurposed to build the very empire that had destroyed their world. Their craft, passed down under duress, became an unintended vector for global technological change. Their individual names are lost to history, their lives buried in the administrative dust of a long-dead empire. But their work, the echo of their forced skill, can be traced in the armor of a Persian cavalryman, the cannon of an early Ottoman sultan, and the design of a Yuan dynasty vase. They are the unseen agents of a global transformation, a testament to the fact that an empire can steal everything from a person, their home, their freedom, their name, but it cannot, in the end, control the spark of the craft itself. The journey through the mechanics of power and servitude is a sobering one. It forces us to look beyond the great stone monuments and battlefield triumphs into the quiet, dark workshops where the real work of empire was done. We are left to wonder at the sheer resilience of human skill, a force that persists and transmits itself even when its bearers are treated as little more than tools, leaving an echo that outlasts the chains.